They call me a survivor, but that word feels too small for what I witnessed. I am Miriam, slave, witness, refugee, and I watched the God of my fathers tear Egypt apart, plague by plague, miracle by terrible miracle, until even Pharaoh himself begged us to leave. You've heard the stories, sung the songs, but I was there when the Nile ran red with blood. I was there when every firstborn in Egypt died in a single night, while we huddled behind doors marked with lamb's blood. I was there when the impossible became inevitable, when the God of slaves proved stronger than the gods of kings. This is my testimony, not of triumph, but of the terrible, beautiful cost of freedom. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mud brick walls of my master's house, but I barely noticed. My hands moved mechanically, grinding grain, kneading dough, the endless rhythm of a Hebrew slave's existence. 23 years I had lived this way, 23 years of bowed head and silent compliance. The other servants whispered sometimes, late at night when the overseers couldn't hear, about the old stories our mothers told, about a promised land, about freedom. But I had learned long ago that hope was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. My name is Miriam, and I survived what the Egyptians would later call the 10 plagues. But surviving and understanding, those are different things entirely. What I witnessed in those terrible, miraculous months would shatter everything I thought I knew about power, about justice, about the God my people claimed had forgotten us. Some call it divine intervention, others the wrath of an angry deity. But I was there. I saw the water turn to blood while I was drawing from the Nile. I felt the frogs leap across my bare feet in the darkness. I watched my master's face transform from smug certainty to desperate terror as plague after plague descended upon Egypt like the closing of a great fist. They say God works in mysterious ways, but mystery feels different when you're living inside it, when every dawn brings fresh horror and every sunset leaves you wondering if you'll see another morning. The Hebrews around me began to whisper of Moses, of signs and wonders, of a deliverance that seemed too impossible to believe. Yet as I swept blood-red water from the courtyard stones, as I cleared dead frogs from the kitchen, as I watched my master's firstborn son grow pale and still in the final terrible night, I began to understand that impossibility and truth are not always opposites. What haunts me most isn't the plagues themselves, though they were terrible enough. It's the realization that came slowly, like dawn breaking over the desert, that I had been complicit in my own bondage, not through weakness or cowardice, but through something far more insidious, the quiet acceptance of injustice as simply the way things are. I had made my peace with slavery, carved out small comforts within its confines, even found a kind of safety in knowing my place. When the call to freedom finally came, it terrified me more than any plague ever could. The first sign came at the river. I remember the exact moment. My water jar half submerged, the morning light dancing on the Nile's surface like scattered gold. Then the color began to change, not gradually, as if mixed with clay or silt, but instantly, completely, as if the very nature of the water had been transformed. The liquid that emerged from my jar was thick, dark red, with the metallic smell that makes your stomach turn. Blood, actual blood, warm and viscous, staining my hands and the river's edge. My master's household fell into chaos immediately. Servants ran frantically between the well and the river, hoping to find clean water anywhere. The Egyptian priests gathered at the water's edge, chanting and making offerings, insisting their magic could duplicate the miracle, as if creating more blood was somehow a solution to our thirst. I watched them with a mixture of pity and fascination. They understood the mechanics of power, these priests, but they had missed its meaning entirely. This wasn't a contest of magical abilities. This was something far deeper and more terrible. For 7 days we drank wine when we could afford it, boiled fruit juices when we couldn't, and rationed every drop. The rich Egyptians sent servants farther and farther up the river, hoping to find clean water beyond the plague's reach. But there was none. Every stream, every vessel that had held water now contained only blood. I began to understand then that whatever force had done this wasn't bound by the natural laws I had always accepted. The rules were changing, and none of us, Hebrew or Egyptian, slave or master, truly understood what that meant. But it was during those 7 thirsty days that I first heard the name Moses, spoken with something other than resignation. The Hebrew elders who were allowed to visit our quarters spoke in hushed, urgent tones about a man who had come before Pharaoh, who had stretched out a staff and turned the Nile to blood. A man who claimed to speak for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A man who promised that this was only the beginning. I dismissed it as wishful thinking, the desperate fantasies of an oppressed people. How wrong I was. How utterly, completely wrong. When the water finally cleared and the frogs began, I thought at first it might be relief. Surely hopping amphibians were preferable to blood. I had no idea what true plague looked like. The first few frogs seemed almost amusing, hopping through the courtyards and croaking in the corners. Children laughed and tried to catch them. But then came more. And more. And more. They poured out of the river like a green, glistening army, covering every surface, filling every space. They were in our beds, our ovens, our kneading bowls. They croaked so loudly that conversation became impossible. Sleep became a distant memory. I watched my master's wife, usually so composed and dignified, standing on a chair and shrieking as frogs covered the floor of her bedroom. The servants couldn't keep up with clearing them out. For every frog we removed, 10 more appeared. They died in piles, creating a stench that permeated everything. We burned them, buried them, threw them into the river, but still they came. It was then that I began to understand the true nature of what we were experiencing. This wasn't random natural disaster or bad luck. This was systematic, purposeful. Someone or something was making a point, and Egypt was the canvas on which that point was being written. My master called for his magicians again, and they too produced frogs through their arts. But they couldn't make them go away. That distinction between creating a problem and solving it would become crucial in the days ahead. When the frogs finally died, all at once, as suddenly as they had come, the silence felt almost oppressive. We had grown accustomed to the constant croaking, and its absence left us all on edge, waiting for whatever would come next. We didn't have to wait long. The gnats arrived like a brown cloud, so thick they darkened the sun. They covered everything: people, animals, food, water vessels, until it became impossible to breathe without inhaling them, impossible to eat without swallowing them. My skin became a landscape of tiny bites and welts. The animals went mad, running in circles, beating themselves against walls, trying to escape the constant torment. I watched strong men weep from the relentless irritation, saw proud Egyptian officials reduced to scratching, miserable creatures who could no longer maintain their dignity. And for the first time, I heard the magicians speak words that would echo in my mind for years to come. This is the finger of God. They had tried to replicate the gnats as they had the blood and frogs, but they couldn't. Their magic, their carefully practiced arts, their connection to the gods of Egypt, none of it was sufficient. They were forced to acknowledge a power beyond their understanding or control. I saw the fear in their eyes, the first crack in the foundation of certainty that had kept Egyptian society stable for generations. But Pharaoh's heart remained hard. That phrase would become a refrain in the weeks ahead, spoken by Hebrew and Egyptian alike, with a mixture of wonder and horror. How could any man, having seen such displays of supernatural power, continue to resist? I began to understand that we were witnessing something unprecedented, not just the contest between two peoples, but between two entirely different understandings of how the world worked. Pharaoh represented order, control, the power of human will to shape reality. The plagues represented something else entirely. The possibility that human will, no matter how strong or stubborn, was ultimately subject to a higher authority. When the flies came, I thought surely this would be the end of resistance. These weren't the tiny gnats we had endured, but massive, buzzing swarms of biting insects that made outdoor work impossible. They filled houses until the walls seemed to move with their black, writhing masses. People locked themselves indoors, but the flies found every crack, every opening. The sound was maddening, a constant droning hum that made thinking difficult and sleep impossible. Children cried continuously, and the elderly began to fail under the constant stress and lack of rest. But something changed with the flies. For the first time, I noticed a difference between where the Hebrews lived and where the Egyptians made their homes. Goshen, our district, remained clear. The line was sharp, unmistakable. A wall of flies on one side, clear air on the other. I stood at that invisible boundary, 1 foot in each world, and understood that I was witnessing something that violated every natural law I had ever known. This wasn't random, this was targeted, intentional. The God of the Hebrews was making a distinction, and that distinction included me. It was then that Pharaoh first attempted to negotiate. He called for Moses and Aaron, offered limited permission for the Hebrews to sacrifice to their God, but only within Egypt's borders. I watched this exchange from a distance, saw Moses shake his head firmly. This wasn't about religious accommodation, this was about freedom. Complete, total, unprecedented freedom. The flies vanished as suddenly as they had come, but the precedent was established. Lines were being drawn not just between Hebrew and Egyptian, but between those who belonged to the God of Abraham and those who belonged to the gods of Egypt. The 5th plague brought death to the livestock, and with it, the first real threat to Egypt's economy. Cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, sheep, goats, every animal belonging to the Egyptians died within a single day. But again, the Hebrew livestock remained untouched. I helped bury dozens of animals, their bodies rigid and strange in the way of sudden death. The smell of decay joined the lingering odors of rotting frogs and dead gnats, creating an atmosphere of corruption that seemed to seep into everything. My master stood in his empty stables, staring at the place where his prize horses had been. I had groomed those horses for years, knew each one's temperament and habits. Now they lay still, their eyes glassy and vacant. He turned to me then, this man who had owned me for over 2 decades, and for the first time I saw not anger or frustration, but genuine fear. "Your God," he said quietly, "what does he want?" It was the first time he had ever acknowledged that the Hebrews served a deity distinct from Egypt's pantheon. It was also the first time he had asked my opinion about anything that mattered. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt hollow. These weren't victories in any sense I could celebrate. Every plague brought suffering to people I knew, people who had never personally wronged me. The Egyptian servants who had worked alongside me, the children who had grown up in the household, the old woman who had taught me to weave, they were all trapped in the same system that enslaved me, just at different levels. The God of my fathers was demonstrating his power, but that power came with a cost that touched everyone. The 6th plague brought boils, and with it, a new level of personal, physical suffering. The festering sores covered everyone, young and old, rich and poor, master and slave, except the Hebrews. I watched proud Egyptians reduced to moaning, pustulant creatures who could barely stand. The magicians themselves were so covered with boils, they couldn't even appear before Pharaoh. For the first time since this all began, I felt genuinely sorry for my oppressors. Pain, I realized, has a way of stripping away all pretense, all social distinction, all the artificial barriers that separate human beings from one another. Yet even as I felt compassion, I also felt a growing sense of separation. Each plague that passed over the Hebrews while afflicting the Egyptians made it clearer that we were different peoples with different destinies. I had spent my life trying to fit into Egyptian society as much as a slave could, learning their customs, their language, their ways of thinking. But the God of Abraham was making an unmistakable distinction. You are not one of them, and they are not one of you. It was liberation and loss simultaneously, freedom from one identity, but the necessary abandonment of another. Pharaoh called for Moses again, promised to let the people go if only the plague would end. The boils healed overnight, leaving only faint scars as evidence of what had been. But by morning, Pharaoh's heart had hardened once more. I began to understand that we were witnessing something beyond mere stubbornness. This was a man who literally could not bring himself to yield, even in the face of supernatural intervention. Whether this was divine hardening, personal pride, or some combination of both, I couldn't say. But I could see that each plague, each moment of relief, each returned promise made the next refusal more inevitable rather than less. The seventh plague brought hail unlike anything Egypt had ever experienced. The warning came first, Moses declaring that any person or animal left outside would die, but those who took shelter would be spared. Some Egyptians believed and brought their servants and livestock inside. Others, either from disbelief or stubborn pride, left everything exposed. I helped secure the Hebrew quarter, moving elderly relatives and small children into the strongest buildings we had. Then we waited. The storm that came that night redefined my understanding of nature's power. These weren't normal hailstones, but chunks of ice the size of a man's fist, falling with enough force to kill livestock and shatter trees. But more than that, fire ran along the ground, actual flames that spread through the hail, consuming everything in their path. The combination was impossible, terrifying, beautiful in its destructive majesty. The very elements seemed to be warring against Egypt, with Moses as their conductor. I stood in the doorway of our shelter and watched my master's house partially collapse under the weight of the hail. The garden where I had worked every day for years was obliterated, every plant uprooted, every tree stripped bare or broken. Egypt's agricultural season was essentially destroyed in a single night. But in Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, no hail fell. The line of demarcation was so sharp that I could walk 10 paces and move from devastation to complete calm. It was another reminder that geography itself was bending to serve the purposes of the God of Israel. When morning came and the storm ceased, I helped survey the damage. The economic impact was staggering. Most of the flax and barley crops were destroyed, though the wheat and spelt, being later crops, survived. Egypt's priests emerged from their temples, looking haggard and confused. Their gods controlled the weather, they had always taught. Storms were divine communications, to be interpreted and appeased through proper ritual. But this storm had ignored their authority entirely, responding instead to the words of a Hebrew prophet who served a God they didn't recognize. For a moment, it seemed like Pharaoh might finally yield. He called for Moses and Aaron, admitted he had sinned, asked them to pray for relief. There was something almost broken in his voice, a crack in the absolute authority that had defined his reign. But even as he spoke, I could see the calculation behind his eyes. This was political maneuvering, not genuine repentance. When the thunder stopped and the hail ceased, his heart hardened again, exactly as Moses had predicted it would. The eighth plague brought locusts, and with them the complete destruction of everything the hail had left behind. I had seen locust swarms before, small ones, natural phenomena that caused local crop damage. But this was different in scale and intensity. The insects covered the land so thickly that the ground couldn't be seen. They consumed every green thing, every plant, every leaf, every blade of grass that had survived the hail. In a matter of hours, Egypt went from a damaged but recoverable agricultural state to complete barren desolation. I watched Pharaoh's own officials plead with him to let the Hebrews go. "Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" they asked. These were men who had supported his policies, who had profited from Hebrew slave labor, who had every reason to maintain the status quo. But they could see what their king apparently couldn't, that continuing this contest would destroy everything they were trying to preserve. The pragmatic voices of survival were being overruled by something more powerful than reason. Moses and Aaron were brought before Pharaoh once more, and this time he seemed ready to compromise. The Hebrew men could go, he said, but the women and children must stay. It was a clever proposal, ensure the men's return by keeping their families as hostages. But Moses refused. All would go, or none would go. Young and old, men and women, livestock and belongings, everything together. Pharaoh's face darkened with rage, and he ordered Moses and Aaron out of his presence, threatening death if they ever appeared before him again. As the locusts finally departed, eaten by a wind that came from the opposite direction and drove them into the Red Sea, I realized we were approaching something final. The back-and-forth negotiations, the partial concessions, the temporary reprieves, all of it was coming to an end. Either the Hebrews would gain complete freedom, or they would face complete destruction. There would be no middle ground, no compromise, no gradual reform. The God of Abraham was demanding everything, and Pharaoh was refusing everything, and something had to break. The 9th plague plunged Egypt into darkness so complete that it could be felt. Not the darkness of night, when stars and moon provide some light, but an absolute, tangible darkness that seemed to press against you like a physical weight. For 3 days, no Egyptian could see their hand in front of their face, could move safely through their own home, could venture outside without becoming completely lost. People stayed where they were when the darkness fell, paralyzed by the impossibility of navigation. But in the Hebrew dwellings there was light, natural light, as if the sun still shone normally for us, while the rest of Egypt remained in supernatural shadow. I could walk from my quarters, where everything was clear and bright, into the Egyptian section of the house, where darkness so thick it felt solid surrounded me immediately. It was another reminder that the distinctions being made were absolute, non-negotiable, and utterly beyond human control or comprehension. During those 3 days of darkness, something changed in the Hebrew community. People began to gather, to talk openly about leaving Egypt, to make actual plans rather than harbor secret hopes. The older slaves, who had given up dreams of freedom decades ago, began to speak of seeing the promised land. Children who had been born into bondage started asking questions about what life might be like outside Egypt's borders. The darkness that paralyzed our oppressors became, for us, a space of possibility and preparation. When the light returned to Egypt, Moses appeared before Pharaoh one final time, despite the death threats. This time the offer was stark and uncompromising. Let my people go, or face the death of every firstborn in Egypt. Not negotiation, not compromise, not gradual reform, complete liberation, or ultimate catastrophe. I wasn't present for that conversation, but word of it spread quickly through both the Hebrew and Egyptian communities. The final plague would target something more precious than livestock, more valuable than crops, more irreplaceable than property, the future of Egypt itself. The instructions that came to the Hebrew community were specific and strange. Each family was to take a lamb, examine it for 4 days to ensure it was perfect, then slaughter it at twilight. The blood was to be painted on the door frames, lintel, and doorposts, and the meat consumed entirely before morning. Anything left over must be burned. We were to eat dressed for travel, with sandals on our feet, and staff in hand, ready to leave immediately when the call came. I had participated in many Egyptian religious ceremonies over the years, had observed the complex rituals that governed their relationship with the divine, but this was different. Simpler in practice, but deeper in meaning. The blood on the doorway wasn't meant to inform God of our location. An omniscient deity hardly needed such markers. It was meant to mark us, to ourselves and to our neighbors, as people who believed that deliverance was coming and were prepared to act on that belief. As I painted the blood on our doorway, using a branch of hyssop as Moses had instructed, I realized I was performing an act of faith unlike any I had ever attempted. Everything in my experience told me that slaves don't go free, that Pharaoh's power was absolute, that hoping for radical change only led to disappointment and punishment. But the blood on my doorframe declared otherwise. It announced to the world that I believed in the possibility of liberation, even when such liberation seemed impossible. The night of the final plague was unlike any other I had experienced. We ate the lamb quickly, nervously, dressed and ready to travel. Outside, Egypt settled into what seemed like normal evening routine, though there was an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel. The previous plagues had established a pattern: supernatural intervention, followed by Pharaoh's temporary yielding, followed by his renewed resistance. But something felt different this time, more final, more severe. At midnight it began, not with the gradual onset of previous plagues, but suddenly, simultaneously, throughout all Egypt. A sound I had never heard before, and pray never to hear again. The wailing of parents discovering their children dead, the cries of servants finding young masters cold and still, the keening of wives over husbands who had been alive and healthy hours before. It rose from every Egyptian household like a wave of pure grief, overwhelming and inescapable. I stayed inside our dwelling as Moses had commanded, but the sounds penetrated the walls. In the Hebrew quarter, families huddled together, alive and safe but traumatized by the agony surrounding us. Children asked their parents what was happening, and the answers came in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might somehow attract the destroyer that was passing over our marked homes but entering every unmarked dwelling in Egypt. When morning came and we were finally allowed outside, the scene was unlike anything I could have imagined. Every Egyptian household was in mourning, from Pharaoh's palace to the humblest servants' quarters, from the prison where condemned criminals awaited execution to the temples where priests served the gods of Egypt. The firstborn of people and animals alike lay dead, but not from disease or injury. They had simply stopped living, as if the spark that animated them had been extinguished by an invisible hand. My master's oldest son was 19 years old, a young man I had watched grow from childhood. He had always been kind to the Hebrew servants, had sometimes intervened when overseers were too harsh, had even learned some of our language and customs out of genuine curiosity rather than contempt. When I found him in his bed that morning, peaceful as if sleeping but cold to the touch, I wept for him. He had done nothing to deserve death except be born Egyptian and firstborn in a time when the God of Abraham was demonstrating his power over the gods of Egypt. The theological implications overwhelmed me, even as I helped prepare for our departure. This wasn't simply the rescue of an oppressed people. This was divine judgment on a scale that redefined my understanding of justice itself. The Egyptian firstborn who died that night included innocent children, kind masters, servants who had been as trapped in the system as we were, even animals who had no moral agency at all. Yet they died while we lived, not because we were more righteous, but because we were chosen. The arbitrariness of it, if it was arbitrary, terrified me almost as much as the liberation thrilled me. Pharaoh's summons came before dawn. Moses and Aaron were called to the palace, and this time there was no negotiation, no conditions, no attempts at compromise. "Get out," Pharaoh reportedly said. "Take your flocks and herds and leave, and bless me also." The king of Egypt, who had resisted supernatural intervention for months, who had hardened his heart against 9 previous plagues, was now begging the people he had enslaved to intercede with their God on his behalf. The reversal was complete, total, and devastating in its implications. Word spread through the Hebrew community like wildfire. We were leaving. Today, now, immediately. After 400 years in Egypt, after generations of bondage, after lifetimes of hoping and despairing and hoping again, freedom had come suddenly, dramatically, irrevocably. Families who had never traveled farther than the local market began preparing for a journey into the unknown. Old people who had never imagined living to see deliverance began packing belongings they had never expected to take with them. The Egyptians, traumatized by the night's losses and terrified of further divine wrath, pressed gifts upon us as we prepared to leave. Gold jewelry, silver vessels, fine clothing, items that represented months or years of our labor were given freely, almost desperately. They wanted us gone before their God decided to inflict further punishment, but they also seemed to understand that some cosmic balance required compensation for our years of unpaid service. We left Egypt not as fleeing slaves, but as a people enriched by those who had oppressed us. As I walked away from the only home I had ever known, carrying belongings that had belonged to my master's family just hours before, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that defied easy categorization. Joy at freedom warred with grief for the Egyptians I was leaving behind, gratitude for deliverance mixed with guilt over the price that had been paid for it, excitement about the future combined with terror about the unknown challenges ahead. The God of Abraham had indeed remembered his covenant, had heard our groaning, had acted decisively on our behalf. But divine deliverance, I learned, is more complicated and more costly than the simple stories suggest. The column of Hebrew families stretched farther than I could see in either direction. 600,000 men, plus women and children, plus the mixed multitude of other slaves and foreigners who had chosen to join our exodus. We moved slowly, heavily burdened, frequently stopping to help the elderly or tend to crying children. Behind us, Egypt smoldered in ruins, economically devastated, politically shattered, religiously confused, demographically wounded by the loss of every firstborn. Ahead lay the wilderness and the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, but also uncertainty, hardship, and the challenge of becoming a free people after centuries of bondage. As the sun set on our first day of freedom, I looked back one final time toward Egypt. The land was still there, the Nile still flowed, the pyramids still rose toward the sky as monuments to Pharaoh's eternal power. But something fundamental had changed. The God of Abraham had proven stronger than the gods of Egypt. The cry of the oppressed had been heard and answered, and the impossible had become inevitable. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the wilderness, and I sensed there would be many, we had already experienced the greatest miracle of all, the transformation from slaves to free people, from property to participants in our own destiny. The pillar of cloud that appeared to guide us through the wilderness was unlike anything I had ever seen, too dense and structured to be natural, too responsive to our movements to be coincidental. It moved when we needed to move, stopped when we needed to rest, and provided both guidance and protection as we journeyed toward our uncertain future. As I walked beneath its shadow, still clutching the silver cup that had been pressed into my hands by my former master's widow, I realized that freedom was not a destination, but a journey, not a single moment of liberation, but a daily choice to trust in the God who had brought us out of Egypt with signs and wonders. The plagues had ended, but their meaning would echo through generations yet unborn. We had witnessed the power of the God of Abraham to challenge seemingly absolute earthly authority, to make distinctions between peoples and purposes, to bring judgment and salvation simultaneously. We had seen that liberation sometimes comes at a terrible cost, that divine justice operates on scales beyond human comfort or comprehension, and that faith requires the willingness to act on possibilities that seem impossible until they become inevitable. As stars appeared in the desert sky and the pillar of cloud gave way to a pillar of fire, I settled down to sleep in the wilderness as a free woman for the first time in my life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new wonders. But tonight, under the protection of the God who had heard our groaning and remembered his covenant, I was no longer Miriam the slave. I was Miriam the delivered, Miriam the witness, Miriam the survivor of 10 plagues, who had seen the finger of God redraw the boundaries of the possible. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.